Elle sort de son lit, tellement sûre d'elle, la scène.
At 52, Matthieu Chedid, known simply as M, finally allowed himself to speak about the woman whose silence haunted him for years. In a rare interview, he smiled with a kind of sadness and said, "She sings like she's trying to forgive herself." He was speaking about Vanessa Paradis, the voice of an entire generation, the eternal symbol of youth and grace, who had vanished from the world of music when her heart and her faith in herself quietly broke. After her separation from Benjamin Biolay, the French press speculated endlessly about her exhaustion, her withdrawal, her fear of the stage. But no one saw what was really happening behind the closed doors of her Paris apartment, a woman whose world had gone silent. Her guitar gathered dust. Her notebook stayed empty. For the first time in decades, Vanessa Paradis, once the muse of Gainsbourg and the voice of Joe Lataxi, no longer sang. Then, one winter evening in 2006, a friend brought Matthieu Chedid to see her. He didn't come as a producer or a collaborator. He came as someone who understood the loneliness hidden inside applause. In that dimly lit living room, he picked up her old guitar, strummed a few uncertain chords, and said softly, "You don't have to perform. Just breathe." Something in his simplicity pierced the fog. For months, they worked in silence more than in sound. There were no deadlines, no expectations, just two souls searching for light through melody. From that fragile beginning emerged what would later become Divine Idylle, an album that critics called joyful. But that was, in truth, born from pain. When Matthieu finally spoke of those sessions years later, he didn't talk about arrangements or production. He talked about the trembling in her voice when she sang again for the first time, and how he knew, in that moment, that she wasn't singing for the world, she was singing to stay alive. It wasn't a comeback. It was resurrection. And it makes one wonder, was Divine Idylle a collection of songs or a diary of healing written in sound? For most of France, Vanessa Paradis had always belonged to the light. She was only 14 when Joe Lataxi made her the youngest pop sensation the country had ever seen. Her smile became a national trademark. Her voice, a symbol of innocence wrapped in mystery. In the decades that followed, she moved effortlessly between worlds, music, cinema, fashion like someone born under a lucky star. She was the muse of Chanel, the gentle rebel of French pop. And for years, The Woman by Johnny Depp's side in a love story that seemed untouchable. To the public, she appeared unbreakable, graceful in interviews, kind but elusive, almost unreal. People didn't see the exhaustion behind the poise, or the quiet tension that had begun to grow in her eyes. Perfection, after all, is a heavy costume. And Vanessa had been wearing hers for too long. After the breakup with Benjamin Biolay, something inside her cracked. They had been partners in music, in art, in sensitivity, but when the relationship ended, the silence that followed wasn't just emotional. It was creative. She couldn't write. She couldn't sing. It was as if the well inside her had dried. Parisian cafes that once felt alive turned into empty stages of memory. Her friends described her as gentle but distant, smiling without warmth, polite but drifting somewhere far away. Then, Matthieu Chedid appeared a man as eccentric as he was tender. With his wild hair and open heart, he had the rare gift of turning pain into rhythm. He had seen his share of solitude. 2 years spent chasing sound to escape the noise of fame. When he met Vanessa again in early 2006, he sensed that her silence wasn't laziness, but grief. He didn't ask her to write or to perform. He invited her to play. Their first sessions weren't recorded. They were conversations in melody. He would improvise on guitar, and she would hum fragments, sometimes out of tune, sometimes on the verge of tears. In those early weeks, he understood something no one else did. She wasn't ready to make an album. She was learning to feel again. Music, for them, became a language of mercy. They began to meet regularly at a small studio on the left bank. No producers, no labels, no deadlines, just her voice, his guitar, and the quiet understanding between two wounded artists. Matthieu often said that the hardest thing was not getting her to sing, but teaching her to believe in her voice again. She had lost trust. He would later recall, in the industry, in love, in herself. So, every note had to come from a place of truth, not fear. The press would later describe Divine Idylle as a sunny pop record, but inside the studio, it was something far more fragile. The songs carried coded messages, whispers of heartbreak disguised as melodies of joy. When she sang Les Pieds or Dès que je vois, the words sparkled, but her tone trembled. The lightness the public adored was, in fact, a mask she was trying to reassemble. There were nights when she left the studio without a word, her eyes swollen, her hands shaking. Matthieu would stay behind, listening to the echo of her last note fade into silence, as if the room itself was trying to hold on to her presence. Sometimes, he wouldn't touch a single instrument, just sit in that silence, honoring the weight of what she had released. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The media still called her La Femme Fatale Douce, the timeless muse. Yet, within that small circle of sound, she was no longer the idol. She was simply Vanessa, human, raw, vulnerable. By the time the album began to take form, it was less a project and more a ritual. Matthieu structured the music around her emotions, letting her lead even when she didn't realize she was doing it. Every lyric she dared to write, every note she dared to record, became a step out of darkness. The illusion of perfection was gone, replaced by the courage to be incomplete. When Divine Idylle was finally released in 2007, the public celebrated it as her radiant return. The cover showed her glowing, carefree, smiling as if nothing had ever broken her. Critics hailed it as a rebirth of French pop, and audiences fell in love all over again. But very few understood what they were truly witnessing, not a comeback, but a healing disguised as art. Behind that effortless voice were months of tears, doubts, and fragile victories. Each song was a small resurrection, a whispered declaration that she had survived her own silence. For Vanessa, Divine Idylle wasn't proof that she had overcome heartbreak. It was proof that she could still feel. And for Matthieu, it wasn't just an artistic collaboration, it was a silent promise he made to a friend. I will help you find your song again. In every studio take, in every gentle strum of his guitar, he was rebuilding the invisible bridge between her and the world she had lost. And by the time the album reached the public, that bridge had become something sacred, a passage between pain and beauty. Because sometimes, the greatest illusion of all isn't fame or perfection. It's the belief that an artist's smile means she's happy. There are moments in an artist's life when the world stops applauding and all that remains is the echo of one's own heartbeat. For Vanessa Paradis, that silence was deafening. After years of existing in the public eye, her every smile captured, her every heartbreak analyzed, she found herself in a void where even her reflection felt like a stranger. When she began working with Matthieu Chedid, she didn't arrive at the studio as a singer. She arrived as someone trying to remember how to feel. There were no producers watching, no photographers waiting, just dim yellow light, the hum of an amplifier, and the quiet breathing of two people who understood that creation begins in fragility. Chedid never asked her to be perfect. In fact, he told her, "Perfection is sterile. Let your cracks make the sound." So she did. At first, her voice came out small, uncertain, trembling like a child's first word after a long illness. He didn't interrupt. He just listened to the pauses, to the sighs, to the way her breath carried pain and memory. Some nights, she would start singing and then stop, her voice breaking mid-verse. The sound of her own vulnerability scared her. Fame had taught her to hide, to edit, to polish every flaw into elegance. But healing required the opposite, the courage to be raw. Matthieu would quietly play his guitar until she found her rhythm again. He treated the process less like recording and more like confession. Slowly, music became her therapy. Each lyric was a fragment of her inner diary, each note a small act of surrender. When she sang the opening lines of Divine Idylle, the song that would later define her rebirth, her voice was light, but her eyes were wet. Between takes, she would whisper, "I don't know if I'm ready to be heard again." Matthieu would answer, "Then don't sing for them, sing for yourself." It was the first time in years she allowed herself to do that. Behind the microphone, she rediscovered the language of emotion, one not made of words, but of rhythm, breath, and silence. The sound booth became a mirror, and what she saw reflected back wasn't the polished icon from Chanel ads or the cinematic muse from Noci Blanche. It was a woman learning to forgive her own fragility. Her pain didn't disappear, it transformed. That's the paradox of healing. It doesn't erase the wound, it teaches you how to carry it with grace. For Matthieu, watching her sing was like witnessing an awakening. He would later describe it as a kind of birth, but reversed, as if she was coming back from a place she almost didn't return from. He was there not as a savior, but as a witness. They shared long nights of silence, moments where no sound was needed because everything essential was already vibrating between them. Sometimes, after a take, she would sit on the studio floor, barefoot, eyes closed. He would let the guitar strings ring softly until the room filled with what words couldn't hold. It wasn't romance that connected them, it was recognition. Two souls who understood that art can be the last refuge of those who no longer know how to speak. Outside that studio, life went on: tabloids, gossip, fashion campaigns. But inside, time dissolved. The clock didn't exist, only the pulse of the music did. She began to smile again, not for the cameras, but from a place of quiet relief. Her laughter returned, first hesitant, almost shy, and then her confidence followed. When Divine Idylle was completed, Matthieu suggested they record a stripped-down acoustic version, just for themselves. In that private session, she sang each song slower, softer, almost like a prayer. By the final track, her voice was trembling, but clear. When the last note faded, there was no applause, only the sound of her exhale, long and steady, as if she had finally released something she'd been holding for years. She looked at him and said, "I think I can breathe again." That moment, simple, quiet, human, was the true masterpiece. The world would later call Divine Idylle a pop triumph. Magazines printed words like radiant, light, and effortless. But those who truly listened could hear the ache beneath the brightness. The smile on the cover wasn't a mask, it was survival. The shimmer of her voice came not from youth, but from endurance. Every song carried an unspoken line, "I am still here." And isn't that what every artist longs to say? That after all the applause, after all the heartbreak, after every silent night, I am still here. For Vanessa, this wasn't merely a return to music, it was a reconciliation with herself. The young girl who once sang Joe the Taxi had grown into a woman who understood the price of harmony, that beauty can bloom from brokenness, that melody can rise from mourning. In interviews years later, when asked about Divine Idylle, she didn't talk about the success. She spoke of peace. "It was the album that saved me," she said softly, "because it reminded me that I could still love something. That something wasn't fame or validation. It was creation itself, the act of transforming pain into sound, and sound into meaning." Every artist reaches a point where art stops being performance and becomes survival. For Vanessa, that point was 2007. Her songs weren't entertainment, they were oxygen. Her studio wasn't a workplace, it was a sanctuary. And in the quiet partnership with Matthieu Chedid, she rediscovered what all true artists eventually must, that the purpose of creation is not to impress, but to heal. By the time the album was released, her voice carried a calm strength, not the brightness of youth, but the serenity of someone who had walked through darkness and found beauty waiting. Matthieu later described the experience simply, "We weren't making music. We were making light." And maybe that's why the world felt so drawn to Divine Idylle, because it wasn't just an album. It was a heartbeat, a reminder that music, at its purest, is not about fame, nor melody, nor rhythm. It's about survival. About the moment when a broken voice dares to sing again, and in doing so, teaches the rest of us how to keep living. Years later, when Matthieu Chedid was asked about Divine Idylle, he didn't call it an artistic success. He called it a miracle of survival. For the first time, he revealed that Vanessa hadn't wanted the album to be released at all. To her, those songs were too personal, too fragile. They were her way of healing, he said softly, not her way of performing. This confession changed how many saw her so-called comeback. What the world had celebrated as effortless charm was, in truth, the sound of a woman learning to live again. And Matthieu had carried that secret quietly for years, protecting it like a sacred memory. He remembered the final day of recording. Vanessa had just finished singing Les Piles. The studio was silent except for the faint hum of the guitar. When the last chord faded, she didn't smile. She just sat there, tears tracing her cheeks, her hands trembling. Matthieu wanted to comfort her, but he knew the silence was part of the healing. Finally, she whispered, "I am not sure I can ever sing these songs in front of anyone." And he answered, "Then we will sing them for the sky." She laughed through the tears, but her eyes betrayed something deeper, the fear of being seen again. For someone who had spent her entire life under the spotlight, she was terrified of exposure. "Fame," she once said, "is a light that burns, not warms." When Divine Idylle was released, the brightness returned. Television appearances, photo shoots, interviews. But Matthieu noticed that after every performance, she withdrew a little. The applause that once thrilled her now left her empty. To him, the concerts felt like echoes of something sacred that had been stolen. And yet, there was one moment that changed everything. During a live show in Paris, she sang Divine Idylle and forgot a line. The audience, thousands of people, began to sing it back to her. For a brief instant, she stopped, listened, and smiled. It wasn't the smile of the star they knew. It was the quiet, tearful smile of someone realizing that her pain had reached others and that, somehow, They understood. After the concert, she told Matthieu, "Maybe that's what music really is. We share our wounds so no one feels alone." That was the revelation. The truth she had been running from. Healing wasn't about hiding the pain, it was about letting it echo. When Matthieu later spoke about that night, he described it as a kind of grace. I saw her reborn, not as a star, but as a human being. The biggest shock wasn't the success of Divine Idylle. It was the realization that what saved her wasn't fame, or love, or even strength. It was vulnerability. For years, Vanessa had lived behind layers of control, the poised interviews, the immaculate image, the soft-spoken perfection. But behind the microphone, stripped of everything, she found truth in imperfection. The tremor in her voice, the hesitation before a note, these became the most beautiful parts of her art. In one of his later concerts, Matthieu shared a story that few knew. He said that during one of their earliest sessions, he had left a recorder running as she hummed absent-mindedly between takes. When she found out, she asked him to delete it immediately. He didn't. He kept it not for release, but as a reminder. He said, "It was the most beautiful sound ID ever heard because it was real." Years later, when Vanessa heard that he had kept it, she wasn't angry. She just smiled and said, "Then maybe that's the only true song I ever sang." That, perhaps, was the final revelation that the truest music is not written for others, but for the soul itself. The world applauded Divine Idylle as her return to form. But to those who knew, it was something deeper, the diary of a woman who turned her silence into melody. In the end, Matthieu's confession revealed not scandal, but grace. He hadn't saved her. He had simply given her the space to save herself. And maybe that's the hidden truth of all great collaborations. They aren't built on fame or genius, but on empathy, the quiet art of listening. For Vanessa, Divine Idylle will forever remain both her wound and her cure, a love letter written to pain, answered by music. Because in that recording booth, between fear and forgiveness, she didn't just find her voice again. She found herself in the years that followed. Vanessa Paradis often said that Divine Idylle was not her comeback, it was her reconciliation with life. She never spoke of it as an achievement, but as an awakening. When asked what she had learned from that chapter, she answered simply, that music doesn't save you. It reminds you you're still alive. There is a tenderness in that truth, the acceptance that healing is not a destination, but a rhythm you must learn to dance with. For Vanessa, every melody became a breath, every lyric a fragment of forgiveness. The album that the world played on repeat was, to her, a journal of survival written in invisible ink. Matthieu Chedid called it the music that healed her. But perhaps it also healed him, in helping her rediscover her voice. He rediscovered his faith in the purpose of art. Not to dazzle, not to dominate, but to understand. Their collaboration proved something rare, that creation, when born from empathy, can become a shared form of redemption. When Vanessa performs those songs today, her tone is lighter, freer. The pain hasn't disappeared, but it has found harmony. She no longer hides behind perfection. She sings with the wisdom of someone who has seen her own darkness and chosen to make light from it. In that, there is a lesson not only for artists, but for anyone who has ever broken and dared to rebuild. Because art, in its truest form, is not decoration. It is declaration of life, of endurance, of the quiet miracle of beginning again. Vanessa's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful acts of strength are the softest, to breathe, to sing, to try again. And that healing rarely looks like triumph, it looks like persistence. At the heart of Divine Idylle lies a simple message, one that transcends fame, language, and time, that even when the world falls silent, the soul can still hum a tune of its own. Perhaps that is why her voice still lingers, not because it is perfect, but because it is human. And maybe, in the end, every artist, every person is just trying to do what Vanessa did, to turn pain into sound, and to learn how to breathe again.